There are moments when a story does not arrive with urgency, but with quiet weight. Nothing appears broken. No official announcement interrupts the day. And yet, something begins to shift beneath the surface. The kind of shift that makes people pause, reread, and listen more closely than before. This is one of those moments. It begins not with an accusation, but with a reconsideration, a revisiting of details that many assumed were settled, a sense that a familiar account may not be wrong in spirit, but incomplete in structure. And when that realization starts to spread, it rarely does so loudly. It moves through conversations, commentary, and careful language, creating unease without naming a clear cause. In recent weeks, public discussion has returned to a well-known family story that was once framed as deeply personal and largely private. At the time, it was received with sympathy and warmth. The tone was emotional. The focus was human. Few questioned the background details because the moment did not invite that kind of scrutiny. But now, that same story is being viewed through a different lens. Not because new accusations have been made, not because any wrongdoing has been established, but because some commentators are suggesting that the way the story entered the public record may not align fully with how similar events are typically documented. This has not been officially confirmed. No formal statement has been released. Still, the questions persist. What happens when a personal narrative becomes part of a public archive? What happens when emotional testimony meets institutional process? And what happens when no one steps forward to clarify the difference? This is not a story about guilt or innocence. It is not a story about intention. It is a story about records, about how certain accounts harden over time, while others quietly change shape, and about how silence, in some cases, becomes its own form of response. At first, the discussion was limited, confined to a few careful voices. But as days passed, the absence of clarification began to draw attention of its own, and that is where the situation began to change. Because when no one corrects the record, people start asking whether it no longer belongs to anyone at all. And once that question is asked, it does not easily disappear. Section 2. To understand why this discussion has resurfaced, it helps to step back and look at how the story first took shape and why it carried such influence in the public mind. In this fictional world, the family at the center of the conversation occupies a space that is both symbolic and institutional. Their actions are followed not only because of who they are, but because of what they represent. Over time, even personal milestones become part of a larger narrative, one that blends tradition, protocol, and public expectation. When the original story was shared, it was presented as a personal account. The language was warm and reflective. It focused on emotion rather than structure. Viewers and readers were invited into a moment that felt intimate, almost protected from scrutiny. In that context, questions about timing, confirmation, or institutional procedure felt inappropriate, even intrusive. And for a long time, there were no such questions. The narrative settled into place. It was repeated across interviews, documentaries, and commentary. Each retelling reinforced the same core understanding, not because it was challenged and defended, but because it was never challenged at all. Silence, in this case, allowed the account to become familiar, and familiarity often reads as truth. Behind the scenes, however, the situation was more complex. Large institutions rarely operate on emotion alone. They function through documentation, authorization, and process. Even in matters involving family, there are layers of verification that exist not to control the story, but to maintain consistency and legal clarity. According to public commentary, this is where the quiet tension began. Some observers noted that the way the story was told did not clearly align with how similar events had been handled in the past. The difference was subtle, not enough to spark immediate concern, but enough to raise internal eyebrows among those familiar with institutional norms. At the time, these observations remained private. There was no public dispute, no official clarification. The institution involved did not step forward to confirm or correct the narrative, and because the story involved a child, restraint was widely seen as the responsible choice. That restraint, however, came with a long-term cost. As years passed, the original account was referenced as settled history. It appeared in timelines, background pieces, and explanatory segments. Each time, it was framed as already known, already accepted. The story's emotional origin shielded it from procedural examination. But institutions remember differently than audiences do. Records are not shaped by tone. They are shaped by dates, approvals, and documentation. And when a narrative becomes widely cited without ever being formally anchored to institutional confirmation, it exists in a kind of unresolved space. Not false, but not fully verified either. This distinction rarely matters until someone points it out. In this case, renewed discussion began after a respected commentator revisited the timeline, not to challenge the personal meaning of the story, but to examine how it entered the public record. The focus was narrow. It centered on process rather than motive, on sequence rather than sentiment. According to those familiar with the commentary, the suggestion was not that the story was invented or deceptive, but that it may have been simplified in ways that obscured institutional realities. That suggestion alone was enough to reopen a conversation many believed was long over. Once raised, the question could not easily be contained. Why had no formal confirmation ever been issued? Why had the institution remained silent when the narrative first circulated? And why, now that questions were emerging, was there still no clarification? None of these questions accuse. They imply uncertainty rather than fault. Yet uncertainty has its own power, especially when it touches on credibility. The individual most closely associated with the original account had built much of her public presence on openness and storytelling. Her strength lay in framing experiences through personal truth. That approach resonated with audiences, particularly those who valued emotional honesty over formal distance. But emotional honesty does not always translate cleanly into institutional record. This is where the tension truly begins. Because when a personal story becomes part of a public archive, it is no longer protected by intent alone. It becomes subject to comparison, verification, and repetition. And if discrepancies exist, even small ones, they tend to grow more visible over time. At this stage, no official body has stated that the record is incorrect. No statement has been issued to affirm or deny the emerging discussion. Everything remains in the realm of commentary and analysis. Still, the silence has created space, and in that space, early questions have started to gather weight. This is the point where many observers began to sense that the situation was no longer static. The background details, once considered settled, were slowly becoming the focus. And as attention shifted away from emotion and toward structure, the tone of the conversation began to change. Section 3. At this point, many people started asking questions, not because they were looking for scandal, but because the shape of the story no longer felt fixed. The early discussion remained careful. Most commentary avoided firm conclusions. Instead, it focused on how narratives form and why some versions endure longer than others. The question was not whether the original account was sincere. Few doubted that. The question was whether sincerity alone is enough when a story becomes part of a public timeline. According to public commentary, the renewed attention centered on sequence, when information was shared, how it was framed, and what, if anything, had been formally acknowledged at the time. These are not emotional questions, they are procedural ones, and that difference mattered. In similar situations within this fictional universe, institutions often release brief confirmations, sometimes just a line, sometimes nothing more than a date. Those small details anchor stories in the public record. They provide reference points that later accounts can return to. In this case, those anchors appeared absent. Some observers suggested that the absence may have been intentional, a choice made to protect privacy. Others argued it was simply overlooked during a period of change and transition. No single explanation was confirmed, but the lack of clarity created room for interpretation. As discussions continued, analysts began comparing this situation to past examples, not to draw direct parallels, but to illustrate how deviations from routine tend to attract attention over time. When a process changes without explanation, people notice, even if they do not react immediately. This is where the conversation widened. Media panels that initially treated the issue as niche began addressing it more openly. The language remained cautious. Phrases like "some commentators suggest" and "according to public analysis" were common. No one claimed access to definitive proof. Instead, the focus stayed on what could and could not be verified publicly. Visual references played a subtle role. Old footage resurfaced, not as evidence but as context. Clips that once felt warm and complete were now viewed with a different awareness, not because they had changed, but because the framework around them had. For the person most closely tied to the narrative, this shift carried risks. Her public image had long been built on narrative confidence, on speaking clearly and decisively about her experiences. That confidence, once an asset, now placed her at the center of scrutiny. Supporters argued that the scrutiny itself was unfair. They pointed out that many public figures share personal stories without institutional footnotes. They questioned why this story, in particular, was being re-examined. According to them, the focus on process missed the point of the story entirely. Critics responded differently. They argued that when a story intersects with public institutions, it cannot rely solely on personal framing. The standards change, not because the individual loses ownership of her experience, but because the record extends beyond her voice. This disagreement defined the early phase of the debate. Importantly, it remained a debate, not a verdict. No accusations were formalized, no conclusions were reached, but the tone had shifted from curiosity to concern, not concern about wrongdoing, but about durability. Would this version of events endure if left unsupported by formal confirmation, or would it slowly be replaced by a quieter, more procedural understanding? As this discussion unfolded, attention naturally turned to others involved. Observers noted that key figures who might have added context were absent from the conversation. There were no attributed explanations, no attempts to bridge emotional narrative and institutional record. Some analysts suggested this absence was strategic. Silence can limit escalation. Others believed it reflected uncertainty about how to respond without amplifying the issue. Both interpretations were speculative. Neither could be confirmed. What was clear, however, was that the lack of response allowed the discussion to continue on its own terms. With each passing day, the questions became more refined, less about what people felt, more about what would remain documented years from now. That distinction is subtle but powerful. This is where the situation moved beyond casual commentary. Because once a story is framed as a matter of record, it stops being resolved by reassurance. It requires either confirmation or correction, and in the absence of either, the uncertainty becomes part of the story itself. That uncertainty did not erupt, it accumulated. And as it did, patterns began to emerge that suggested this was no longer an isolated discussion, but the early stages of something more lasting. Section 4. This is where the situation began to change in a more noticeable way, not through new information, but through repetition. As the discussion continued, the same questions kept resurfacing across different platforms, often phrased differently but pointing to the same gap. When did the account become public? What institutional steps, if any, accompanied it? And why had those steps never been clearly described? Repetition matters in stories like this, not because it proves anything, but because it signals that uncertainty has not been resolved. Each time the questions returned, they did so with slightly more confidence, as if the lack of response had given them permission to remain. According to media analysis, a pattern emerged in how the story was being handled by those with authority. There was no direct denial, no clarification, no contextual explanation, just continued distance. That approach is not unusual when privacy is involved, but over time it began to look less like protection and more like disengagement. For observers familiar with institutional behavior, that distinction raised concern. In previous situations within this fictional setting, even minimal clarification had been used to stabilize narratives. A simple acknowledgement could close speculation. Here, nothing arrived. The silence stretched on, and with it, the space for interpretation widened. As this happened, the tone of commentary evolved again. Analysts stopped asking whether the original account was accurate and began asking whether accuracy was the right measure at all. Instead, they focused on authority, who had the standing to define the record, and who had stepped back from doing so. The individual at the center of the narrative now faced a different challenge. She was no longer being questioned about her experience, but about her role in shaping how that experience entered public memory. That is a subtle shift, but it carries significant implications. Supporters continued to defend her, emphasizing that personal stories do not require institutional approval to be valid. They warned that demanding such approval risks dehumanizing public figures. These arguments resonated with many viewers, especially those wary of rigid systems. At the same time, critics pointed out that this was not a private diary entry. It was a story shared widely, referenced often, and treated as part of an official timeline. Once a story is used that way, they argued, it invites a different level of scrutiny. This tension hardened into a familiar divide. On one side were those who prioritized lived experience. On the other were those who prioritized recorded history. Neither side claimed absolute truth, but both insisted that their standards should guide interpretation. The absence of mediation between these standards became more noticeable. Normally, institutions or representatives step in to bridge the gap, to explain how both can coexist. In this case, that bridge never appeared. Visual media reinforced the shift. Past footage was replayed not for emotion, but for analysis. Pauses were noted. Language was examined, not to accuse, but to interpret. These readings remained speculative, but they influenced perception nonetheless. Another pattern emerged involving silence from secondary figures. Individuals who had previously spoken during moments of tension remained notably quiet. According to some commentators, this suggested legal caution. According to others, it reflected uncertainty about how to respond to a conversation framed around documentation rather than intent. Regardless of the reason, the effect was the same. The burden of narrative defense appeared increasingly concentrated on one person. That concentration intensified scrutiny, even among those who were sympathetic. Media language adapted accordingly. Words like controversy faded. Terms like record and timeline took their place. This change signaled a shift away from emotional debate and toward long-term implications. Once framed that way, the story could no longer be resolved quickly. Because records do not respond to appeals, they respond to evidence or clarification, and in this case, neither was forthcoming. As days turned into weeks, the pattern held: silence from institutions, continued calm from commentators revisiting the same questions, gradual acceptance that this uncertainty might persist. This is how tension builds in stories like this, not through escalation, but through endurance. And as the discussion settled into a steady rhythm, attention began to turn outward, toward how the public, the media, and the institutions themselves were responding to a narrative that refused to stabilize. Section 5. What followed only added to the complexity, because the reaction was not unified. It fractured along familiar lines, shaped by trust, fatigue, and long memory. Among the public, responses varied quietly rather than dramatically. Some viewers disengaged, seeing the discussion as overly technical. Others leaned in, not out of suspicion, but out of concern for how stories are handled once they leave private space and enter collective memory. For this group, the issue was not about choosing sides. It was about understanding how uncertainty becomes normalized. Media coverage reflected this divide. Early reporting had treated the renewed discussion as a minor recalibration, something of interest mainly to specialists. But as the questions persisted without response, outlets adjusted their tone, not toward accusation, but toward observation. Panels became more restrained. Commentators spoke slowly. Words were chosen carefully. There was a shared awareness that nothing being discussed had been officially confirmed. Every segment carried reminders that no formal statements had been issued, and that much remained speculative. Yet the very act of repeating these cautions underscored the problem. If nothing could be confirmed, why had nothing been clarified? Some journalists framed the situation as a case study. They spoke less about the individuals involved and more about the mechanics of narrative authority, how stories gain legitimacy, how silence can either protect or destabilize, and how institutions sometimes lose control of narratives not through action, but through absence. Within institutional circles, the reaction was reportedly cautious and constrained. According to public analysis, there was awareness that responding could create precedent. Once an institution corrects a personal narrative retroactively, it risks being drawn into future disputes of a similar kind. The cost of engagement, in that sense, was long-term. At the same time, some observers suggested that non-engagement also carries cost. When an institution allows an external interpretation to stand unaddressed, it risks allowing that interpretation to become default. Over time, repetition hardens perception. What begins as commentary can become reference. This tension appeared unresolved. Public-facing institutions did not issue guidance. There were no background briefings, no quiet clarifications offered to trusted intermediaries. The approach remained consistent: distance and restraint. For the individual at the center of the discussion, this created an uneven landscape. She was visible. Her past statements were accessible. Her tone and language could be revisited endlessly. The institutions, by contrast, remained abstract and unreachable. That imbalance shaped public perception, even among those who resisted drawing conclusions. Supportive voices continued to emphasize intent and context. They argued that revisiting a family story years later served little constructive purpose. According to them, the discussion risked prioritizing bureaucracy over humanity. These arguments found receptive audiences, particularly among those weary of prolonged public scrutiny. Opposing voices focused on precedent. They noted that public narratives involving institutions often outlive the people who tell them. In that context, accuracy becomes a shared responsibility. not to undermine personal truth, but to ensure that the record remains coherent. Neither position prevailed. Instead, they coexisted, reinforcing the sense that the story had reached an impasse. Social discussion mirrored this pattern. There was no viral surge, no single moment that defined public reaction. Instead, there was steady, low-level engagement, the kind that does not burn out quickly because it never burns brightly to begin with. As the days passed, the media began referencing the situation as an unresolved matter rather than an active controversy. This subtle shift mattered. Unresolved stories linger. They resurface unexpectedly. They become footnotes that invite further explanation later. Institutions appeared to accept this outcome. According to some commentators, allowing the story to settle without intervention was seen as the least disruptive option. It avoided escalation, it preserved boundaries, and it placed responsibility for interpretation back onto the audience. Yet that choice also meant accepting ambiguity as part of the public record. This is why the discussion did not end with a statement or a correction. It moved instead into a quieter phase, one defined not by reaction, but by persistence. And that persistence raised a final, unavoidable question, not about what happened then, but about why the story continues now. Section 6. This is why the story has not faded, even without new developments or official statements. In many public narratives, time acts as a soft eraser. Attention drifts, new stories take its place, details blur, and what once felt unresolved slowly loses urgency. That has not happened here, and the reason has less to do with the individuals involved and more to do with the structure of the discussion itself. At its core, this situation sits at the intersection of personal storytelling and institutional memory. Those two forces operate on different timelines. Personal stories live in the present. They are shaped by emotion, reflection, and meaning. Institutional records, by contrast, are built to endure. They are designed to be referenced long after the original moment has passed. When those two forms of truth align, there is rarely tension. When they do not fully align, even slightly, the gap can remain open for years. According to public commentary, this is what keeps drawing attention back to the story. Not outrage, not suspicion, but the sense that something remains undefined. There is no clear endpoint, no moment where the record was formally settled one way or the other. For observers who follow public life closely, unresolved narratives carry a particular weight. They do not demand immediate answers, but they invite future reconsideration. Each time the story is referenced in a documentary, a background piece, or a retrospective, the same quiet question returns. Has this ever been clarified? The absence of clarification becomes part of the narrative. This dynamic is especially persistent in stories involving institutions known for precision and protocol. When such institutions remain silent, audiences are left to interpret that silence. Some view it as respect for privacy. Others see it as avoidance. Neither interpretation can be confirmed, but both continue to circulate. The individual most closely associated with the original account now exists within that ambiguity. Her story remains intact in emotional terms. Nothing has formally challenged her intent or experience. Yet the procedural uncertainty means her narrative no longer stands alone. It exists alongside questions that cannot be answered by personal testimony alone. This creates a subtle but lasting shift in how the story is received. Future audiences encountering it for the first time may not feel the original warmth or immediacy. They may approach it with caution, aware that it has been discussed, revisited, and reframed. Even without accusations, that awareness changes perception. Some analysts have described this as the quiet cost of unresolved records. Nothing is taken away, but something is added, an asterisk, a footnote, a reminder that the story occupies a contested space. Institutions, too, absorb long-term effects. Each decision not to engage sets an example. It signals how similar situations may be handled in the future. According to public analysis, this reinforces a broader pattern where institutions choose boundary protection over narrative control, even when that means surrendering some interpretive ground. Whether that approach is effective remains debated. What is clear is that the story continues not because of momentum, but because of durability. It does not rely on headlines. It lives in references, in discussions about credibility, in conversations about how history is written when voices and records do not fully align. No one involved has escalated the situation. No one has formally closed it either. And in that space between action and closure, the story remains. This is not a failure of communication. It is a reflection of competing priorities. And as long as those priorities remain unchanged, the discussion will continue to surface, quietly and persistently, whenever questions of record, authority, and memory come into focus. That is why, even now, the story feels unfinished. And that brings us to the final reflection. Section 7. In situations like this, resolution does not always arrive in the form people expect. There is no closing statement, no final correction, no moment where everything is put back into order. Instead, the story settles into its place slowly, shaped less by answers and more by how it is remembered. What remains striking is how little actually changed on the surface. No new facts were confirmed, no official wrongdoing was suggested, and no authority stepped forward to declare one version definitive. Yet the impact was real, because perception shifted even without proof or conclusion. This is often how long-running public narratives evolve, not through exposure but through adjustment. The emotional version of the story continues to exist, intact and meaningful. Alongside it now sits a procedural uncertainty that never quite goes away. Neither cancels the other. They coexist, creating a more complicated legacy. For the individual at the center, this moment marked a rare loss of narrative certainty, not because her voice was removed, but because it was no longer the only frame through which the story was understood. That change does not erase personal truth, but it does alter how confidently it stands on its own. For the institutions involved, the choice to remain silent reflected a familiar calculation: protect boundaries, avoid precedent, accept ambiguity rather than invite deeper scrutiny. In the short term, that choice limited escalation. In the long term, it allowed questions to persist without resolution. And for the public, the outcome was neither satisfaction nor outrage, but something quieter, a lingering awareness that some stories, once released, cannot be fully retrieved or refined. They live on through repetition, reference, and omission as much as through confirmation. No one involved has claimed victory. No one has conceded error. The absence of dramatic closure is itself the ending. It reflects a reality of modern public life, where stories are rarely settled cleanly and records evolve without announcement. Years from now, this moment may be remembered not for what it revealed, but for what it demonstrated: how personal narratives can drift when they enter public space, how institutions manage uncertainty by standing still, and how silence, intended as protection, can become part of the record. Nothing here requires judgment. There is no need for certainty where none has been offered. What matters is understanding how this unfolded and why it continues to feel unresolved even as attention moves elsewhere. Because in public life, stories do not always end when the conversation stops. They end when the record feels complete. And in this case, the record remains open.